All right, well, good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me all right? See a lot of head nods shaking. Thank you. My name is Senator Donovan Fenton, and I'm proud to represent this community. I want to thank you all for taking the time to be here tonight to join us on an important conversation about the future of our communities and our property taxes. Tonight's discussion is focused on something that many of you are feeling directly, and that is rising property taxes, increasing pressure on local budgets, and the growing gap between what the state funds and what municipalities are expected to deliver. Over the past several years, we have seen what's called cost downshifting, where the state reduces its fair share of funding, and that responsibility falls directly onto cities, towns, counties, and ultimately the people in this room, the property taxpayers. We're also seeing this play out in education, where even the modest increases in school budgets can result in significant spikes in local tax rates because of declining state aid. We're fortunate to have a strong panel with us here tonight with different perspectives across local and regional government. I'd like to introduce them now. We have Chris Coates, Cheshire County Administrator. We have Elizabeth Furland, Keene City Manager. Robert Millay, Superintendent of Keene School District. And Margaret Burns, Executive Director of the New Hampshire Municipal Association. Thank you all for being here and for the work you guys do every day. Now, before we begin, we should have had note cards sent out to you guys. We are getting the note cards now, so they'll arrive in a second. Please write down your questions throughout the discussion. We're going to collect those and move into a Q&A around 7 p.m. So some questions tonight will be directed to specific panelists, and others will be open, and I encourage everyone on the panel to jump in where it makes sense. So we're going to get right into it. How did we get here? Let's start with the big picture. This question is open to all the panelists. How would each of you describe how we got to this point where local governments and property taxpayers are carrying more of the financial burden? And Chris, if you'd like to kick us off.
Before we get going, if there's people that are looking for seats, there are some seats. There's 2 seats down here. There's another seat here. There's about 6 or 7 seats I see around, so you don't have to stand if you don't want to. You may sit next to somebody you don't know, but that's okay. It's what's about community. Yes.
All right, so to follow up, folks, the question was, how would each of you describe how we got to this point where local governments and property taxpayers are carrying more of the financial burden? And essentially, what's changed over the past decade in terms of this? Need a microphone? All right. Never mind. Never mind.
Good evening. Thank you for taking the time to be here tonight. 2 quick things. You'll notice that we do have a camera in the back. We are filming this so that we can, I'll get the film, we'll send it out to others so that they can put it on their website so you can share it with others or people can view it and go from there. I also want you to know that when you came in, you may have seen that the county had some documents. Hopefully you all got them, and it's really a document that breaks down our departments. It breaks down our programming, our staffing, and then the backside, a lot of numbers that I think you're looking for. It's just so you had an idea. We have that for every town in the county because you remember we have 22 counties in the city of Keene in Cheshire County. So how did we get here? So you know, what's interesting to me is that the state in the late 60s, they actually, some people call it the Great Reform at the time, because they really took a look at how they could work hand in hand with towns, with municipalities, with counties, and with the school district. And out of that came a lot of great ideas around funding supports. From the pension plan is a great example of something that came out in 1967, 68, 67. And there were other business profit sharing that went on, and it was just a time where they were looking at how to work together. But over the years, what we've seen is that it's gone away from that type of thought, and because of that, it's put an incredible pressure on. I can speak for the county, but I think everybody on the panel will say the same thing. It's really put a pressure on how we do business, and from our perspective, you look at it and you think. And this is all that you can find through the Department of Revenue Administration, or you can find through the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute, and it's about cost shifting of over $3 billion down to all of us, and We've only increased taxes during that time, or levied taxes at that time at 1.28 billion. Had we received the funding, we'd actually be in a very different scenario. But over time, that's been taken away. And the easiest example, because you're going to hear about multiple ways tonight, the easiest example is the pension fund. There was 4 different pensions at one point, and they said we would like to have one single pension. And if the New Hampshire retirement system was born. And at the time, they said, we're going to pay 35%. For teachers, actually, it was 40%. And in 1977, they lowered it down to 35%. And then over time, what they saw is that they, I think it's 2011, and that they decided to lower it down to 25%. And then in 2015, they got rid of it. 0 increase. Do you know what that means to the city of Keene alone? Think about that. Whether, it is a promise that was broken. And so you have the county in that mix, you have the school district in that mix, and you have the city of Keene in that mix. That was how I look at it, so close to $2 million forever burden that we had to take on, because they made a decision to walk away from something that they had agreed to do. So today, you're going to hear more and more about these broken promises, and I'll let others, because I have a litany of lists in here of things that they have done, but I'm going to let others attempt to explain that too. And I thought, if it's all right, Margaret, if you could just chime in and just give a little bit of history too from your perspective.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you everyone for being here tonight and including me on this panel. I echo everything Chris said and want to give sort of an even broader look at where we are. So if I'm thinking about the question of how we got here, it's sort of 2 parts for me. On the one hand, it's a system that relies heavily on local property taxes to fund budgets locally. And I think that's a really important thing to understand. And I think some of the questions and discussion that we have later on this evening will talk a little bit more about that. But New Hampshire is a state that, per our system, per our statutes, we rely heavily on property taxes at the local level, meaning municipalities are restricted in what they can raise locally other than property taxes to fund local expenses. And the other piece of it is sort of a history of what's been referred to as cost shifting, sometimes referred to as downshifting, and some of which Chris has already referenced, where aid that was given to the state, by the state to municipalities, or revenue that was previously shared between the state and municipalities has either been done away with or cut significantly, right? And so when you have a revenue stream and then it's cut or it's cut down, that's going to impact what you're able to do locally, or it's going to impact what you have to raise locally for property taxes. So really what we saw was in the aftermath of the Great Recession, so sort of in the 2010, 2011 legislative session, we started to see some of the substantial changes that are compounding and have been compounding up until now and will continue to do so unless there are changes made. So those big cuts or big changes are going to include what Chris mentioned, the state's contribution to local retirement system costs. So for police, fire, and teachers, it used to be that the state statutorily provided 40% of that to political subdivisions as a way to offset local costs to pay towards the pension. And that was part of sort of a deal that the state and municipalities struck many years ago. It used to be the case that cities and towns had local pensions and the state had a desire to consolidate, and there were benefits to consolidating and having one system across the state. But sort of the quid pro quo was, you'll consolidate with us and the state will contribute a share towards the positions locally that are required to be part of the New Hampshire retirement system. So we used to see a state share of that cost locally, and in the aftermath of the Great Recession, we saw it cut and then entirely repealed. So it went from 40 to 35%, and then ultimately it went down to 0%. And it's now been a decade and a half since we've seen that revenue come back to cities and towns. We've seen changes in the distribution of the municipal share of the meals and rooms tax, or the meals and rentals tax. So you're probably familiar with the meals and rentals tax. You see that 8.5% on your restaurant bill or your hotel bill. It used to be 9%, but it was cut in the last few years to 8.5%. So municipalities were supposed to share 40% of that revenue that came into the state. There's a rationale for that. Cities and towns bear essentially an equal burden of the tourism that comes into our state. So the idea was that they should also share in the revenue and the benefits of tourism that comes into our state. But what we saw in really even before the Great Recession, but continuing afterwards, was cuts to the municipal share, as well as level funding of the municipal share. So rather than providing a percentage as the municipal share, level funding it year to year so that municipalities didn't get the benefit of any increases that were being brought in to the meals and rooms tax. We saw a catch-up formula implemented that was meant to catch municipalities back up. That was then suspended in the years to follow. And only in 2021 did we see a substantial change to the law that did at least bring municipalities to 30% share of the meals and rooms tax, which has been very positive. But of course, we've never gone back to where we originally were at the 40%. Other changes would be that there used to be a statute that allowed or required for municipalities to share in general fund revenue. So this means that municipalities were supposed to get a share of the general unrestricted funds of the state. That statute was suspended for over a decade before it was repealed this past biennium at the legislature. And we've also seen other sort of unreliable ups and downs in streams of revenue from the state, such as for things like sewer projects for the state aid grants that help fund some of those bigger infrastructure costs. So we're really looking at many years, well more than a decade, of cuts and changes to state aid to cities and towns. And then I think it's a clear line, if you think about it, from that to where municipalities need to come up with more funding in order to continue to pay the local costs that they have.
Well, we'll keep going. So thank you for that. I think that laid out kind of how we got to this situation and where we're at. And we talked a lot about cost downshifting and what downshifting actually means. I want to move on to our municipal manager. You know, as your perspective as a city manager, how do you define this cost downshifting in New Hampshire, and what are the most significant examples we're seeing today?
Yeah, so Chris and Margaret both touched on several of the items I'm going to speak about, but cost shifting has really not been one thing. It's been one thing after another, small changes over a long period of time. And I would say that the promises that were made back in the 60s and 70s, we started to see those promises erode away, like Margaret was saying, after 2008. And it was one small change or one freezing of a revenue source, and until they eliminated several things. And so it's really a bunch of different actions over a period of time. And it's when the state decides to reduce or eliminate a revenue that we are receiving, or if they are requiring us to do something at the local level without a funding source to do it, or if they're shifting shared systems such as education, transportation, public health, and human services more to the local level. That's also downshifting. And we're seeing a lot of that right now at the education level in terms of funding of education and the state not holding up their end of the bargain, and we'll talk more about that. And then it's just expecting us to maintain and continue to do the same work we're doing with less money. And so that's really how I defined downshifting. We have some real examples here, and I tried to pull a few numbers for you. Retirement, as they were mentioning, the New Hampshire retirement system was created for statewide system for the municipalities, the county, the school, the police, and the fire employees through pooled contributions. And I want everyone to understand that once we signed on to that, we now have members of the retirement system who are expecting benefits from that retirement system. It's not, and we are required to continue to contribute to that retirement system, even though they are not keeping up their end of the bargain. They're not giving us another option. We still need to fund that retirement system. And so that has been one of the significant changes that we've seen. And so today, Keene pays approximately $3 million annually for police and fire retirement. And 35%, which is what the state was paying, is roughly $1.04 million a year. That is a direct shift of $1 million to the local taxpayers without another option in terms of funding our retirement account. So that's approximately 45 cents on your tax rate per year. It's probably about $13 million year to date that they haven't paid to us. And I understand why it happened. They were struggling to balance their budgets, and they were looking for ways to reduce their expenses. Unfortunately, they did it on all of our backs, and it became our problem at the local level. The other thing, and Margaret was talking about this, is the meals and rooms distribution. So that was enacted in 1967 as a statewide tax to tourism and economic activity. And municipalities were supposed to be sharing 40% of that because we are providing roads and infrastructure, police, fire protection, utilities, and all the services that support tourism and economic development. So the intent was to share 40%, but that actually stopped earlier than the 2008 timeline. Actually, it started back in 1977, again in 1981, and it wasn't until 1993 when a formula was created to catch up towns to get them to 40%. And we all thought, oh, finally, we're going to get to 40%. That did not happen. We are at 30% right now because that formula changed again. But what does that mean to us here in the city of Keene? Well, for Keene, that roughly represents $700,000 a year. That's 30 cents on your tax rate. And year to date, it's really hard to estimate because the numbers that we were collecting throughout the state differed and there was different rates. But even if at 700,000 all the way back 30 years, you're at least talking 20 to 30 million dollars that they have not paid to the city of Keene for meals and rooms distribution. Then we had revenue sharing. And that was this broader revenue sharing program that they created back in 1969 to return a portion of the state revenues back to municipalities. And it wasn't just out of the goodness of their hearts. It was because we were taxing back then agriculture, goats and sheep and all sorts of things. And instead of us municipalities taxing that property, the state wanted a different system. And they created this business profit tax system. And they said, look, we know we are now taking this away from you and we need to give the towns and cities something back. And so we're going to share revenue with you. And that was the business profit, the revenue sharing program. Unfortunately, they did freeze that for a little while and then they totally eliminated it. And it was eliminated back in 2009. Before that, we were receiving $992,000 a year. That's again almost another $1 million annually, another 40-cent impact on your tax rate. Just those three examples, and there are lots more smaller examples. Those are the larger ones for towns and cities, but when they decide not to fund bridge aid, and you have red listed bridges in your community that need to be fixed. When they decide not to fund the road program, and you have a road project in the 10-year plan that has now become a 15-year plan because they're not funding it at the level that they should be. All of those things add up, and it just adds up to this continued strain on the local tax rate.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that question. Before we continue, we have note cards that we are going to hand out. We were able to get those. So write a question if you have at the end of this. We're going to collect them and answer those for you. Going to keep you in the hot seat for a second.
Okay.
I just want to ask, how does this impact your ability to plan long term, especially when we're talking about capital projects,
Yeah.
things like that? And are we being forced to make trade-offs? Are municipalities cutting services? Are we delaying investments, or both? And answer a little bit. I'd like to hear from the other panelists as well on
Sure.
that.
So the answer to that question is twofold. One, if we're not able to rely on the revenue year to year, it's hard to plan on that and how much we will actually be able to collect. But I want to give you just a current real life example. I talked a little bit about the highway funding and the bridge funding. Well, as the statewide funding becomes more constrained, capital projects are delayed and on waiting lists, and those waiting lists grow at the New Hampshire state level as they continue to not fund those plans appropriately. In Keene, it's had some real operational impacts. So, for example, weight restrictions on bridges that affect truck traffic, school buses, and emergency responses while we wait for funding. That happened this year. So in Keene, we have 10 municipally owned red listed bridges. And what that means is those bridges are in desperate need of repair. And you're on a list. There's a statewide list for bridges. And there's more than 200 statewide bridges on this red list. In late 2025, the city had to impose a 10-ton weight restriction on the Spring Street and Beaver Street bridges. This has impacted delivery trucks, fuel trucks, school buses, and heavy emergency apparatus. So these are real impacts when these infrastructures, these projects, these bridges are not funded, and they are real consequences to the local community.
Thank you for that. Rob, you look lonely down there, so we're going to move into school funding for you. And I just want you to share a couple examples of how state cost shifts or funding gaps are impacting school budgets.
Well, thank you, Senator Fenton. I think we've heard about the retirement contributions being downshifted. So for next fiscal year, for our next operating year, that would actually translate into us needing to raise an additional 1.8 now that it is no longer being funded at the state level. That 35% you heard my colleagues already talk about. We now have to raise an additional $1.8 million to meet that obligation for our employees. Had we continued to receive that 35%, that would be almost $2 million. Our budget would be down, but it's not. And so we've got to absorb that cost, and we've got to provide that benefit for the people that we hire and that we work with. Some of the additional examples that I would kind of highlight, I guess, special education, that's probably one that a lot of folks are familiar with. There at one time was a really solid structure in place that would reimburse districts for exorbitant costs for special education. It was called catastrophic aid. It's now called special education aid. And at one time, we were getting 80%. Once we hit a certain threshold above the cost per pupil, we would get reimbursed 80% of those costs. Now, that 80%, if we're lucky, we're seeing 67, 68 cents to the dollar. So that has significantly reduced those reimbursements, which go to the future year's revenue, which allows us to not have to raise as much money for taxation, through taxation. Those two really jump out to me as some of the leading drivers for education. But by and large, our public schools are some of the most regulated structures we have in the state. We have to hire personnel with specific credentials. We have to provide transportation from home to school, back to home. Those things aren't reimbursed, at least not at a rate that we would see. We're required to provide the transportation, but we don't receive funding to meet that requirement. So I think my colleague from the city had referred to it as, well, we call it unfunded mandates. You know, when you have these mandates that you have to provide and the service that you have to provide, but there is no funding stream that is tied to it, who picks up the bill? We do. Those are the things that stick out to me. Transportation, special education, the retirement, building aid has been grotesquely reduced. And so as we try to maintain our schools, keep them current, keep them modern, keep them, you know, pleasant for students to come into, to be in an environment where they're able to best learn, the yeah, the building aid has been drastically reduced as well from the state level, you know, if we get any at all. So, you know, a number of these things that were once well funded at the state level are no longer being funded at the state level, and they're now the expectation, well, if you're going to continue to provide the services, and I get it, I hear it all the time, but your enrollment has gone down, so you should be able to cut your budgets. And let's be real honest about this. You know, if I lose 10 students in the Keene School District, I don't get to cut my budget by 10 students. I don't need one less teacher for that, even 100 students. If it was at Keene High School, which is our largest school, if we lost 50 kids, that doesn't mean, okay, well, 50 kids, that should be the workload or the caseload of a teacher, so you can cut a teacher. It doesn't, the math does not ever work that way. If I use a smaller school in one of our town districts, like Marlow, for example, where they've got roughly 40 students, if 2 kids go out, I can't lose a teacher because I still have students that need to be taught. So our fixed costs don't often change until we are able to make those changes and meet the needs of the students when they come into our buildings. And so I think those are the big drivers that I've seen in my time. You know, I can't cite anything from 1960s. I wasn't really around at that time.
I wasn't either.
Yeah, so I'm gonna go on the good word of the folks who are up here with me and say, yeah.
But you know what? I think, you know, Rob, thank you for that. You hit the nail on the head on a lot of things, talking about the mandates that are driving these costs at the local level. And I want to talk about, you know, the declining state aid that you mentioned. And is the current adequacy funding model we have working?
Oh, wow, that is such a loaded question. So here's
the idea.
Here, yeah, no, here's what I would say. Here's what I would say about that, right? Our public schools are very highly regulated, as I sort of articulated before. You know, we've got to have certain credentials for our staff, and we've got to provide a lot of these other things. And we receive a base adequacy total of about $4,300 per student, $4,300. So there's now this other mechanism to encourage people to buy into what's called an education freedom account so that they can go to a school of their choice, a private school or homeschool or whatever the case might be. That funding starts at about $5,300. So if you want to go to public school, we're only going to pay $4,300. But if you want to go to a different school, here's a check that will help offset those expenses by $1,000 more. So it's more beneficial to go to a different school. But what is really impactful is when those students take that education freedom account, and I'm all for school choice. Please don't misunderstand me. I am absolutely for school choice. But when they take that education freedom account and they go to a different school, it's kind of like a double hit, right? We don't get that adequacy funding in the local school district because they're now not a member of our school. So that $4,300, if you take, let's just use simple math, if you take 10 students, that's $43,000 that would have come into the school that no longer goes to school. And if you take those 10 students at 53, they're now paying $10,000 more for those students to go to a school other than the public school. So you ask me if the adequacy funding is working. I think there have been some recent court decisions that have suggested that it's not. And I think it's a constitutional issue that we have not resolved as a state. We know that the state of New Hampshire ranks last in terms of state funding across the country. And when we hear data that comes from our capital, they say, well, we've got the highest, one of the highest cost per pupil in the country. That might be. That, that I haven't actually dug in to see if we are truly the highest cost per pupil. What we do know is that the support that comes from the state is the lowest. I do know that. So.
Well, thank you, Rob, and we're gonna move on now to talk about the county and regional role. When we were proposing having this event tonight, when you have a lot of conversations with folks in Keene and in New Hampshire, they often confuse county government with state government, and what essentially are the differences between this. So, Chris, you were looking for a softball, apparently. How would you describe the current role of county government in New Hampshire? And is it working well? Are there gaps? Are we expanding county roles?
That's a big question. We've been, over the last 5 months, the county commissioners, our director of finance, Cheryl Trombley, and others have been going out to the counties, the towns in the county, and really talking about this document that we presented to you tonight, and talking about Cheshire County at a glance. It's because what a lot of people don't understand, and it's interesting to me that one of the individuals, one of the selectmen in one of the towns said, so you're like the quiet backbone of the region. You quietly just do your job. And it's pretty much true. What we do is what we do, 85.6% of everything we do is statutorily required. The other 14% is the support, the IT, the HR, the finance departments. And, if you think about that, 85, what do we have the nursing home. But what many people don't know is the county's responsible for all individuals who qualify for Medicaid who are in a nursing home or at home getting home care. That's our responsibility, and we cover that. We have the corrections facilities, we have the sheriff's department, we have a multitude. It's all right here, all 20 departments, and we do it in a way that supports when the city of Keene has somebody that needs to go to the hotel, what we call the hotel on the hill, and needs to be there for a period, the correction facility. That's what, they need to be there for a period of time, whether it's 24 hours, 48 hours, or longer. That's why we're there. If you have a loved one, you want to have the nursing home here in this community. If we didn't have the nursing home here, then you'd be traveling, loved ones would be traveling a distance to stay in touch with those individuals. The other thing that many don't know is we have assisted living, 20 apartments up at the nursing home that we have people. So a lot of times what we find is that individuals go into those facilities, and the loved ones in the nursing home and the other ones, the other spouses in the assisted living. So we quietly go about our business, but we also, one of the things that's working really well, I think, is the partnerships we have with the people at the table. We have a program called Connected Families New Hampshire. It's a grant that started 8 years ago. It's a program that was 2 people. It was a $4 million grant for 4 years to get a program where we would go in, have staff go in and work with families that have children that are at high risk of out-of-district placement. Now you have to remember, residential placement can be anywhere between $200,000 and $500,000 per child if you're putting them in residential and you're also paying for education. So we're working with families to keep that child in the community, working, because the schools do a great job. They work with, but when 3 o'clock chimes, that child then heads home, and a lot of times the parent needs that support. So that's a partnership that's been going so well that, we told the state of New Hampshire, and the end of the grant, if we don't get some level of daily rate through Medicaid, we're closing the program down. They liked the program, so they gave us a daily rate. So no taxpayer dollars go into that program. It is solely 100% generated through Medicaid monies. And that money turns enough money that it also gives us money to put back towards taxes. So it's a great program because the state liked it so much that they took it to the next level, and they said, can you do it in Sullivan County? Can you do it in Grafton County? Can you do it across the state? And also, by the way, we're going to give you another grant that says that we want to bring kids back out of residential back home, but in a more thoughtful, pragmatic way. So that's our partnerships that we have. We have restorative justice that we're doing at the high school, and that's been a great program that the high school's really taken on to, and it's a program that's right out of the county. And then we have a multitude of things that we're doing. Some of them you'll be hearing in the future about, hopefully, but that's the partnership. We're in constant contact. And the other thing we do is all of us stay in contact about major projects that are going through. And right now, I can tell you, in the county right now, we're in a good situation because we don't see any major bonding projects coming up. We may have some smaller bonding projects, $1 million or $2 million, but not the 30, 40 million type projects that are out there because our facilities are in good shape. And one of our bonds will actually, the Department of Corrections bond ends or matures next year. And so that will go off our costs. So, and the other thing that you need to really, through the county's perspective, we've had major projects that we've had to take on that have not hit the tax base because we've chose to go after grants. One of the biggest projects is probably the sheriff's dispatch. The towers in our communities that communicate for all the law enforcement, because all the law enforcement comes into into our dispatch in the sheriff's office, is they're at end of life, to the point where we're going on eBay to find parts. And so we had a company, Motorola, come out and really do a survey of that. They said it's a $4.4 million project. And we were able to find the funds through grants to cover the costs, so we didn't have to put them into the tax base. But that's the stuff that all of us are doing on a regular basis to try to offset what is being pushed down upon us. And I'll tell you that we did it so well that the Southwest Mutual Aid, Fire Mutual Aid, has asked us to help with their towers. And that's a $5.6 million project that we've been able to raise so far, $2.6 million. If we don't do that, we don't try to figure it out, it's about if they had to bond for all that, it's about a 350% increase to the users, City of anybody that uses that, it would be a 350% increase to what they're currently paying. So we have to go and we have to be aggressive and look at things in different ways. And that's one of the things I think that's working well for us. But I think that from the county's perspective, we're trying to be nimble. We're trying to meet the needs where we're at. It's interesting. You go out into these communities. These communities are, like the City of Keene, are struggling. They have law enforcement. And we hear all the time that the City of Keene, 8 to 9 people down on the police side of things. Well, these departments have 10 people, 5 people. Well, that 10 is 2. That's all they can get. Or they put somebody all the way through the academy. He starts for a few months, and then he sees an opportunity and goes there. We don't blame them at all. We see that at the Department of Corrections all the time. We see that as a ground where people get that taste of opportunity, and then they really want to be in law enforcement, so they get that, and then they move on. And we have to fill that gap. And it is just something that we're constantly looking at, and we're struggling with to figure out all the time. I will also tell you that this on the radio the other day, a caller came in and said, do you ever compare like counties? So is there a county that's like you that you are financially comparing? We can do that on some levels. On some levels we can do that, but not when it comes to the budget, because we have so much that goes into that budget that we have to show everything. We have a grants department in the county. We're really one of the only county that has a strong grants department. We have anywhere between 38 and 42 grants coming in through our grants department. And that's about, and it can be anywhere between $13 and $16 million that we're handling. And a lot of that's passed through that goes to Cheshire Medical because they have a program, but we're the ones that help write the grant. The Rails Trail, you have in the City of Keene, you have pathways, but all the other rail trails around the city, we write the grants for so that we can get those pathways, the rail trails done in a way that makes sense so people can travel on them. And we think that's a good thing. We think it's an economic engine, but we also think it's something that people can get outside and enjoy. So, when you look at it, we are constantly trying to fight the system but it gets harder and harder every year when we're looking at it. And I just want to look and see if I'm missing anything. But I think the biggest issue for us right now is decisions that are made that aren't best practice. Okay, you have revenue, but then all of a sudden you decide to end the dividends and interest tax. Now, some people might like this in that room, and that's great. I'm not saying I'm for, it's just that to me, you canceled out the business tax. You reduced the business tax, not once but twice. The BET tax, you reduced that. That's another. And what Elizabeth didn't tell you too is on the Meals and Room, they actually, it's a 9% tax that so they bumped it up to 30, but then they brought the tax rate of that down to 8.5. So actually, there's a loss there with a gain. And so those are things that we're constantly trying to figure out. And the easiest one for us is the nursing home. All 10 counties together pay up to a certain point. And then the state at the cap, it's called the cap, Medicaid cap. And they pay up to a certain point, and at that point, then the state comes in and pays. And every year in the biennium budget process, we talk about how much the cap's going to rise every year, and it's 2%. 2%. It's been 2% for years. This year they decided at the 11th hour to add 1%. That does not sound like a lot. But what that 1% meant is a $4.4 million increase that was spread across 10 counties. That's a $440,000 increase of now what we have to pay up to before the state will kick in and help pay for the Medicaid costs. Those are the things. What is it? The cuts by a thousand cuts, death by 1,000 cuts, and it's like that is what happened. And what they don't tell you is that they change the formulas, but they also change fees. So if you have an LNA, if you have a nurse that they have to get the credentials and pay for the credentials on a yearly basis, they bump it up. Or if you have a water and sewer treatment plant and we have that at the nursing home, that used to be $100, is now heading towards $4,000. It's little things here and there. Those are the things that we have to come up and try to figure out as we work through it.
Well, thank you for that, Chris. We're going to move along. We're going to move into kind of the state policy and mandates, and we all briefly touched upon that a little bit. And I want to ask Margaret, we provide a lot of examples of this, but can you talk about how these state mandates are increasing costs for municipalities and sort of what are the biggest cost drivers? We heard a little bit about that. And I think we've heard this as well. Are these mandates increasing while revenue and funding is decreasing?
Yeah, it's such a great question, and it's obvious, but it's worth saying that every time the state mandates that cities, towns, counties, or school districts do something new, but doesn't provide funding to do it, then it costs money to the county, town, or school district, right? It's sort of an obvious statement, but it's just a good place to start. And for that reason, the New Hampshire Constitution has a provision, Article 28A, that prohibits unfunded mandates. It prohibits the state from creating new mandates that cost money unless funding is provided. Again, it's a very simple concept. Unfortunately, the unfunded mandate provision has become somewhat more of a suggestion. It's still in our Constitution, but it really has not been respected, and it's not a compelling argument anymore at the state legislature that this is a mandate, it costs money, you have to provide funding or you violate the Constitution. It's not a winning argument, and yet it is part of our Constitution. And so every time the state creates a new mandate and doesn't provide funding, the local governments pay for it. And because local governments are highly reliant on property taxes, it probably means property taxes pay for it. And mandates come in so many different forms. Chris mentioned death by 1,000 cuts. There's small mandates that sort of are new administrative requirements, new little picky administrative requirements that your staff have to handle, or maybe you need another administrative person because it becomes too much of a burden for the staff that you have, and that's a cost. And then there's sort of the bigger, broader cost. So we've had over the past couple years a real push at the state legislature to address housing, and most of that policy has played out in the form of new zoning mandates as in new requirements for municipalities at the local level. And when we talk about increases in population, especially increases in density, the costs that flow from that are the costs related to public services and infrastructure. And if there's not the correlating funding for those increases, then again, cities and towns are going to pay for it. And again, property taxes are going to be the likely place that that funding is going to come from. And so, you know, what's hitting cities and towns other than the mandates, we also have to keep in mind that if you're experiencing the burdens of inflation, you have to remember that your cities and towns are facing it too. Inflation is affecting everything across the board in local budgets: labor, fuel, energy costs, materials, whatever it is. Inflation is impacting municipalities as well. And in fact, we took a look at state aid dating back to 2009 up until present year and tracked sort of dollar for dollar as compared to inflation. And as compared back to 2009, when you apply inflation to the funding, we're actually behind 2009 when the inflation factor is applied. That's how significant of a reality those impacts are. So mandates are sort of the flip side of downshifting. We have the actual dollars being cut or not provided, and then we have the new requirements on local governments that cost money to fulfill.
Well, thank you for that. And next question, I think this is the question you guys all showed up for. What are the realistic paths to property tax relief? Who would like to answer that one?
Do you want me?
Have at it, Mark.
You know, it's sort of like you just put the microphone in my hand, so I'd have to go ahead and start
fine.
with it. So I'll take it. I'll take the hot potato. So I think that there are, let's talk about sort of two paths, sort of 2.5 paths to property tax relief. I'm gonna say the thing no one up here wants me to say, but then I'm gonna walk it back. So the first way is spend less locally, spend less money. Don't spend as much on your staff. Don't spend as much on their health insurance. Don't do the road project. Don't put in that new park. Don't fix that building. Don't put a new roof on the town hall. Don't. That's one way. But you have to have the conversation with yourself about what the cost of not spending the money is. That's the flip side. So you don't spend $1 today. What's the cost 2 years from today? And then if you factor in inflation, every project delayed is more expensive later on, right? So if we know a building needs to be fixed, if we know a roof needs to be put on, if we know we're all blowing out our tires on that road, but we put it off, what's the cost of doing it 5 years from now as opposed to today? So that's number one. It's spend less, but ask yourself what the cost is of spending less. So then we get to option 2, which is sort of a two-parter. One way of property tax relief is more funding from the state level back down to cities, towns, counties, school districts, et cetera. So more funding from the state, whether it's in the form of revenue sharing, whether it's in targeted aid like the state aid grants for sewer and water projects, targeted aid like building aid for school building projects, or general fund revenue sharing like we've talked about with the revenue sharing statute that used to exist, or meals and rooms tax, and sort of that line of thinking. The other piece to it is another way to offset property taxes is to give local governments more ways to raise money locally that is not property taxes. We mentioned at the beginning that New Hampshire is highly reliant on property taxes and that municipalities are highly restricted in what they can raise locally. And this means they are restricted in what they can raise locally for taxes they can raise property taxes. That's what they're allowed to do. And they also are restricted in the types of fees that they can raise locally as well. It's not just come up with any fee that a city or town or a county thinks would be helpful. It really has to come from an enabling statute, meaning a law that allows them to do it. And so a really simple example is that there's been a bill that percolates in the legislature almost every single year. It's usually referred to as the occupancy fee. And it's an enabling piece of legislation that would allow cities and towns to adopt a fee on hotel room reservations. And the fee would go into a local fund that is restricted for the purpose of funding costs that are related to increased tourism. So think roads, think public safety, think what, the tourism towns and cities get as a boom when the tourism season hits. This has been a perennial effort. It has routinely not been passed. It is a small fee. It is optional. And it's meant to offset property tax costs by creating a new way of raising revenue on folks who enjoy the tourism aspects of our state. So if state aid increases are not in the cards, we're never going to stop advocating for them. But there is another way, and it's to think broader. It's to think about how to enable cities and towns to meet local needs in other ways than high reliance on property taxes.
Anyone else want to take a bite at that apple?
Yeah, just a couple of add-ons, and I think that was incredibly thorough, and so I'm not really sure that I like how you started, but you definitely walked it back really well. There used to be what is referred to as a statewide education property tax, where all of the funding from all of the municipalities went into one pot and then it got distributed where it was needed. And that created a lot more balance across the state, and that has essentially gone away. So what's raised on your education, on your tax bill that says state education tax, never actually leaves your municipality. So property-rich places, they raise a bunch of money, but it goes right back to them instead of going into that pot and getting shared across the state a little bit more evenly. So I think reconsideration of how that is administered is something that could be looked at. I think that was also a court ruling that was pretty recent in the last year and a half that says we're not actually fulfilling that requirement as was expected by law. So that one comes to mind. And the other one that comes to mind, and Senator, this might not, maybe this will be popular for you, is to pay attention when you go to the polls in November. Know who you're voting for.
I think you guys did a great job covering that. It does first start with looking internally at what you have and what you want as a community. What do you want for levels of service? What do you want in terms of infrastructure investment? It does always start there. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting with the state about giving us our fair share. And I was at a different meeting this week, and I talked about what are the things I'm most concerned about. I'm concerned about the funding of education. If you look what's happening over the last several years and the impacts that is having on our tax rate, it's incredible and it's unfair. The way that the system is set up right now, it's based on a number. I don't even know where that number originally came from in terms of an adequate education. It's not even close to what an adequate education cost is. And then it leaves the rest of it up to every community to fund. And the problem with that is some communities can fund a level of education similar to what we're funding, and it's no burden to them at all because they have a very high tax base, they have a lake, they have whatever it is in their community. And so it's unevenly burdening communities. The ones that have the higher assessed values are able to afford more. The ones with the lower values aren't. Or if they are doing it, it's pushing it down on that tax rate. And so I'm really, really concerned about that. I do like the idea about more local options. We are always pushing for local control. because there's usually not a fix that fits everyone. There's usually something that's unique in your community that may not be the same for your neighbor, something that you're experiencing. And the more that the state takes away local control, the harder it is for us to address those types of things. And so I think those are, I mean, and obviously we try to increase our tax base, but we only have so much property in our city and not a ton left to develop. So that gets harder and harder as well. And I'll just say one other thing. We always ask for economic development tools from the state, and the ones they give us are always on the backs of the taxpayers. They always are ones that say, sure, you can provide an incentive for economic development if you fund it through your local taxes. It's not coming from the state. Something as simple as the Housing Champions Program, which the city worked really hard to be certified in this Housing Champions Program. We've done a lot of really great work over the last few years to encourage housing development. We did it because we wanted to be able to access funds that they had promised to make available to only the communities that were housing champions. So we put ourselves through that process. And then they quickly took away the money that was associated with it.
I would agree that we have to look internally first, and we do. I mean, for you that you may not know, but when the budget process starts for the county, it starts in August. We adopt the budget in March. We actually, in September, it's when myself and the Director of Finance really start looking at it. In October, we bring it to the commissioners who are here tonight. We spend 5 weeks with the department heads going through line by line and trying to figure out where we're going to land. And then in December, we bring this to the delegation as a whole, present it, and then we pass it over to the executive committee, which is made up of 10 state reps, to in January start doing another 5 weeks of going through and looking at line by line with department heads where we're gonna land on the budget. And we're proud in the county when we take a look at where our taxes to be raised has gone over the last 7-8 years, because if you look at it, and it's on the back side of the document that we gave you, it's in the blue line. In 2019 it was 0.73. In 2020 is 1.39. In 2021, 0%. 1.31 in 2022, 0% in 2023, and negative 0.9 in 2024, and then 3.4 last year. So that if average out, yeah, it's about a 6% increase over that period of time, but it's less than 1% average in that period of time at the same time. And we're still evolving, we're still growing, and that's the big thing, that we need to continue to meet the needs of our communities, and that's what we're hearing at the same time. So it is a fine line. The other thing is we have to create revenue opportunities outside of the tax system, and that's what we do. We look at grants constantly to see if we can do the projects through grants. We have 50 federal inmates. Why? Because our local is about 60, 70, and if we add in 50, that adds about a $2 million or a little over $2 million in revenues that we can put back towards the fund balance to help offset taxes. Those are things that we're constantly doing. But I'll tell you one other thing I didn't bring up before, and I want to say it, is that when somebody comes into our nursing home and they're on Medicaid, they have to qualify for Medicaid, and so they go on what we call Medicaid pending eligible. And so there's a lot of paperwork that has to be done, but we have to care for that. We care for that individual while they're there. Why the state then, we send that paperwork to the state. They're supposed to turn around in 45 days. Okay, so we're paying in 45 days. It's taking about a year for them to turn around. We have 16 of those currently that are pending, and that's lost revenue to us to the tune of $5 or $6 million that we have to come up with through the tax base, because it's statutorily required that we have to do this care. And so where can we start pushing back? That's the other part of it that we need to be doing, and we are doing. I see it all the time that we're speaking out. We're heading up, leadership boards on the municipal sides and on the school sides and in the county side. We're in leadership on those things. We're advocating down in Washington because, listen, for Medicaid rates, the only way we're going to get the Medicaid rate up in New Hampshire for nursing home care is that we go down to down to the feds and tell them bump up the Medicare rate. So if you bump up the Medicare, then I can go back to the state and say you should be matching that. And it does work, because last year we had some success when it came to private insurance bumping up to meet some ambulance rates that they were paying less than Medicaid. And so you can battle back, you can fight. And I will tell you that our state reps in this area are fighters. They go up there all the time. They put out what they want. They speak out on how they want to be heard, and they represent us well. And I appreciate because it's not an easy task that they have up there. And that's what we can, round of applause. But it is, we have to fight back too. We can't just sit still. And so when crazy bills come up, we will be testifying up in Concord. When they tell us, they're going to tell us how we can bond, we're going to go up there and we're going to sit there and listen to them. Then we're going to get up and have them understand, listen, we already have an RSA 33, that we have to abide by when it comes to bonding. There's bond counsel. There's a lot of things that we knew. We just can't go out and spend money. We have to go through all these steps. And when they talk about the county taking over the SAUs, we go up and we testify and say, what are you thinking? You know, and that's what we're going to continue. That's the other side of it, is that we all are up here on a daily basis voicing our concern.
Well, thank you guys for that. We had a couple more questions, but I think it's time we're going to move into the audience questions. I got a lot of orange cards up here, and that's a good thing from a wide range. And this has been a really important discussion. And my first card, which I love, this is a very interesting one, is what is the state doing with the money and revenue they are no longer sharing?
Applying it to their budget.
How about that they whether you agree or disagree with this, it's me, again, it comes back to the best practice, and they developed this voucher system for education that they just open the door up more so. And the bottom line for me is, then don't take away the revenue on the other side. That's my thing. You have the right to do what you want to do, but make a good business decision, because that's what we have to do.
I think what's been happening is, as they are trying to balance their budget and their revenues are declining, they look for ways to cut as well. That would be the simple answer.
Very peaceful.
Hand it to Rob.
You know, that's a really good question. I'm not sure if expenses are, their costs are going down while their revenues go down. But as we look internally, and in this year, we had to reduce our budget by a number of positions to kind of make a little bit more sense of it. I'm not sure if that's happening more universally at the state level. So, I mean, it's a great question and something that we should probably demand answers for. I know everyone's trying to balance their budgets, but are you also reducing your costs, not by shifting these expenses to the localities, but your statewide costs? So it's a great question that we'd love that.
Well, Rob, hold on to the microphone. I'm gonna combine two questions because I think they're a little very important. And let's talk about that SWEP funding. And the question is asking, essentially, we're seeing wealthier communities actually have a lower tax rate than some of these other communities, and that's directly affected by the SWEP. Could you kind of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, if you think, I think Elizabeth touched on it, places with waterfront properties that have higher valuations are generating a lot more revenue, but they might not necessarily have the expenses that come from places like Berlin, Keene, Claremont, Concord, Manchester, Nashua. And so that money that they're actually able to generate in their location with property taxes never actually leaves that. Whereas I was referring to before, there was a point in time where all of that money went into a pot, and then it was disseminated a little bit more evenly, a little bit more fairly to help all the ships rise and not just, the folks who had all the money.
Elizabeth, you want to add to that at all?
I can give a little bit more history. And when that was happening, towns and cities were fighting it out over, you're taking my money, I'm contributing to this fund, and now it's going to you, and that's not fair, which is why New Hampshire Municipal Association doesn't usually get into the middle of it, because they don't want to be advocating for one community over the other. But there were a lot of politics that went with that program.
Margaret, this question is for you. When does the state conclude that downshifting is not sustainable?
When does the state conclude that?
That's a question from y'all.
Um,
At what point are we no longer at the precipice, let's say, but we've fallen off the cliff and we haven't hit the bottom yet?
I ask myself this every biennium, every state budget process. I ask myself that question: what will be the breaking point where this can't happen anymore? And somehow we have not hit it yet. And part of the issue is that property taxes, in theory, are an unlimited pot of money, in the sense that they can just keep going up, right? And so because there's not a specific backstop on it, and because property taxes happen separately from the state budget process, there's a disconnect between state policy and property taxes. And there's a disconnect for people too, right? Because you see your property tax bill and it's coming from the city or town, and that's how it's viewed. And there's not a direct line being made between state policy and what you're seeing in your property tax bill. So there's levels of disconnect, so that make it difficult for me to answer the question of when. We haven't hit when, somehow.
We keep saying there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great question.
So following up in that vein, what would be the top 2 to 3 most impactful things we can do as a community to combat the downshifting of costs?
We need to be more aggressive during the legislative process. And we at the city follow the bills, and I am really appreciative that we are a member of the New Hampshire Municipal Association, and they put out a list and they track bills for us, and we sign up for the bill trackers for all that, the different departments and what the impacts are. And then honestly, we wait until about crossover, because the craziness is usually done by then. There's a lot of bills that come out before we get to crossover that are taken care of until you get there. And when you get to crossover, it becomes really important, because those bills are still alive and you need to weigh in. And so being active in the legislative process, I think, would be helpful. The other thing, and Margaret knows this, but I feel that towns and cities need to band together on the school funding issue. I know it's not under my budget, it's not something, I don't put together the school budget. I don't have authority. I don't do really anything except for we collect the taxes. So that's why we haven't, as a municipality or as a group of municipalities, we have an association of towns and cities, and we can get together and say, this is not right, because it's going to continue to create an issue for us as we move forward if we do not address that school funding issue.
And I love your answer. Making your voice heard is really, really important. And we've seen that have some impact, but maybe not as much of an impact as we would like to see. I've seen pieces of legislation as it's moved through the process be very lopsided with public input, to the extent of like 5,000 who are opposed and 70 who support that, still go through. And so that's a little bit concerning. So I go back to make sure you're paying attention in November of who you're signing up for, really analyze what they stand for, what they believe in, and what they're going to do to represent you. I would welcome the day where it felt like Granite Staters mattered more than specific agendas that we see coming out of our capital.
I have a lot of questions up here. So
Just real quickly on this, not yet. I think the other thing you can do is, the county has a podcast. You have a podcast. We have once a month. I'm on the radio. We have a web page. We have a Facebook page. I'm part of the New Hampshire Association of Counties. I'm on their executive committee, and we have every Friday at 1:00. We have the legislative committee that goes through every single bill, just like you do, and we plan the plan of action for what we're going to do next. So, but more importantly, every Wednesday, 8:30, you can join us on Zoom or in person. We have a commissioners meeting where you can come and listen to the discussions of what we're doing. It's always interesting. There's good laughter at times and some serious talking going on at the same time of seeing how we're going to move forward. And again, really educate yourself to, when you go into the voting booth, of who's going to represent you in a way that meets the needs that we're looking for. That's as easy as that.
May I? I'm just kidding. I think that's really important what they just mentioned, and it's a really good question. It's actually from our counselor, Karen Leo Hill. I appreciate this one because I've heard this a lot in Concord as well, that we are hearing that the municipalities are to blame. It's not the state's fault. It is the municipalities' fault. And I was wondering how you guys respond to that. You've responded a little today, but being a legislator up in Concord, it's always your fault. It's never the state's fault.
So I have been hearing that as well. And I guess I would say I don't have the luxury of balancing our budget on the backs of the state of New Hampshire. And so I'm not sure why they feel they have that luxury with municipalities.
With the exception, of course, all right? So, this is not personal. I think it's important to know that the people up here on the panel actually live here in the community. And so those tax impacts impact us as well. And there's nobody up here who is deliberately saying, hey, look, we've got to do what we can to raise these property taxes. We're trying to provide services for our community. I was in Berlin a couple of weeks ago, and somebody had shared with me, what do you tell the adults who are saying that the public schools are failing and we should shut down the whole public school system? And my response was, well, what's the alternative? Do you want to have a community that doesn't have educated children coming through it? What's that going to mean? What is that going to look like? If you're not providing a solid foundation, and I believe we've got outstanding schools, I honestly do. Otherwise, maybe I wouldn't have my own children in our school system. But if we don't have a solid background for our kids to learn, what does that look like? What does that mean? What does that mean for our community, the dynamics? How are people, being gainfully employed if they don't have an education system? Interestingly, right, public schools, I mentioned, are very highly regulated. One of the things that also comes with public schools is we're not Burger King, and if anyone's a Burger King fan, this is not a dig on them. We don't have the right to refuse service to anyone who comes to our door. We take everyone. We don't, like other places, get to say, sorry, you don't quite fit our mold, so we're not going to enroll you. We take absolutely everyone. And we work really, really hard. Our staff, our teachers, our administrators, our counselors, our nurses, our paras, all of our folks, our custodians, our maintenance crews, they work really, really hard to provide an environment where kids can gain value. And I've said this in a number of different public settings. We are the opposite of oh gosh, Senator, you're going to think I'm picking on you. Car dealerships, right?
Turn off his mic.
And look, it's not a secret. When you buy a new car and you drive off the lot, what happens to the value of that car? The second you drive it off the lot. It's not a reflection of the quality of car that you're getting, but it's just the reality. The moment you drive off the lot, the price or the value of that decreases. When a kid comes into our classes, into our schools on day one, by the time they leave on day 180, our expectation is that you're doing the opposite of what happens when you buy a new car. you are adding value. And I believe that our staff are doing an outstanding job of doing that. Regardless of whether it's an elementary or the middle school or the high school, one of our town schools, I think they're all working really hard to add value to students. The difference is they're all coming in at different levels, whereas some other institutions might have enrollment requirements that they can say no. We don't have that luxury to say no. We take everyone.
All right. Well, thank you guys. You know, we had a lot of questions here, and just for the sake of time and folks getting home tonight, I'm going to make photocopies of these, share them with the panelists. I'm also going to keep them as well because a lot of them are prevalent to the state. So if you guys want to answer these questions, please follow up with one of us because we will do that. And I just want to give the panelists one more opportunity to say your final words before we end tonight.
So, Senator, I want to thank you for organizing this event this evening. I think it's a very important topic and one that we've been talking about at the City of Keene. I also want to thank you for the work that you've done on behalf of the City of Keene around homelessness and reimbursements, and that is an entirely separate meeting we could have on how that system is really broken in the state of New Hampshire as well. And I want to thank you because you helped us here at the city get a bill passed that we are now able to get reimbursed from other communities when we have homeless here, so from another city.
I just want to say thank you for everybody turning out. I'll stick around if you want to ask me some questions that you may have. Not a problem. Two is, could the commissioners just stand up and wave so everybody knows? Terry Clark, Claudia Stewart, Skip DiBernardo, thank you very much. And then any state rep that's here tonight, could you just stand up, please?
State reps.
Thank you very much.
Oh, and he cannot, since he has done that. I have the mayor, Mayor Khan, in the front row. Thank you very much for your support. And I also have several city councilors in the room. If you can stand up for 1 second. Thank you for your support.
I just think this is an important conversation that doesn't stop tonight. It needs to be continued. I know that I can speak for all of us that, I mean, we're open to having conversations on a regular basis. If you'd like to have us do this down the road at some point again, you know, we're willing to do that. I know that, again, we've gone in the county to 22 towns and had this conversation. If anybody knows anybody in Roxbury that we can find the selectmen to have the meeting, that would be great, and we're working on that. But it's really important to educate ourselves so that you don't go with a lot of the misinformation that's out there at times, and that we can have civil conversations in this day and age. I think is healthy for all of us.
And everyone, thank you so much for being here. I want to recognize our executive counselor, Karen Leo Hill, who's also here as well. So. And Margaret or Rob, you got one last?
Yeah, no, I mean, because we are recognizing a lot of other folks. I'd love for, as a person who has 33 bosses, because I have 33 school board members that I answer to, would the folks who are on the school board throughout all of our 7 districts please just sort of stand up so folks can recognize that as well. And just to echo Chris's comments, I think it's really important that we can come together in a setting like this, and thank you for making the time to be here and have a very civil conversation about something that really gets under all of our skins. It's not unique to any individual. I think we're all in the same boat, and so I appreciate your organization, your leadership, Senator, and I appreciate everyone taking the time to be here tonight, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And I would just echo what the panelists say. Stay informed, ask questions, talk to your elected leaders, talk to your municipal leaders, and just figure out what's going on. And don't be afraid to ask questions because there's a lot of misinformation out there and a lot of confusion about how things affect you. So, again, folks, thank you much, and hope to see you soon. Enjoy your night.